I have been in government. I was a kid in 1974 that 1973 and 74 I didn't play outside that year because I was watching the Watergate hearings. I was the kid that was going out with my parents when I was little, knocking doors for Nixon and for all the other candidates that came down the pike. I was handing out push pieces when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. I've been involved in politics really almost my entire life. I love the process. I love the study of it. And when I went to college in 1984, of course, I went into finance and general business because that's what my dad wanted me to do. And when they kicked me out of college, then I went and had to go flip hamburgers for a few years. When I went back, I went and studied political science because that's what my true love and passion was, other than preaching the gospel. And being able to go to school and study about America and the foundational documents upon which she's based and the way in which government works and the way it ought to work, which is just as important, has always been something that's fascinated me. And when I got through my master's degree in public administration, I taught political science. If I could talk, that'd be good. I taught political science for several years at Missouri State University. Political science, public administration, public budgeting, and finance, and my specialty was in those foundational documents of our American founding. So even though I've been preaching the gospel for 29 years now, I've been doing this for 25. And both of them have been my passion, and I have been thankful for the opportunity to be able to do both of them for a long time and try to make a difference in both realms for the betterment of our people, both in and out of the Lord's church. This is a weird year, isn't it? I don't just mean the COVID, I mean that's part of it. But it's just been a bad year. And I think a lot of the reason why it is because people have lost their anchor to the way things are supposed to be. Y'all notice how in the denominational world it just gets weirder and weirder and weirder. They just try to outdo each other. Y'all think you're crazy? Watch this, right? And that's kind of the attitude that a lot of folks seem to have. Whereas the Lord's church, we tend to be not static or stale, but steady. We tend to try to focus on the foundation of the Word of God and how it is that it dictates to us how the church ought to be. It's because of that anchor that we have that we're that way in a world that's constantly changing and moving in every direction all at once. It is exactly the same thing in the political realm when people have forgotten who and what we are supposed to be as a nation. When people have disconnected themselves from those foundational principles upon which this nation was established, eventually, as we see all around us, anything and everything goes. It ought not be that way, but that is exactly the way that it is. And so over the next tonight and tomorrow, I'd kind of like just talk about some of those principles and some of the different questions that are asked of us concerning government and our responsibilities to interact with that. But tonight I want to start a little bit on the foundational principles themselves. Now there's not a lot of Bible in what I'm going to be telling y'all tonight, because I'm going to be focusing on the ancient foundational philosophies that this country was built on, and show you where things came from. Because if we know what the founders were trying to write, we know what they meant, then we can better see what it is that they intended for us to be. Not that they were perfect, but it's supposed to be our anchor politically, the Constitution. And if we can't understand why it was written the way that it was, then we're disconnected and we're adrift, just like the church can be once it disconnects from the Scriptures themselves. So I'll provide this. It's just one page list of different philosophers and what it was they taught, and I'll give this to Daniel. If anybody wants a copy of it, you're more than welcome to have it. but I just want to touch base on some of these basic principles. We're going to go all the way back to Socrates. Socrates actually lived from 470 to 399 BC. He was known as the father of Western philosophy. Now, when I was here last year, we were talking about Islam, and we talked extensively about Eastern mindset, Eastern philosophy. This is exactly the opposite. This is the Western philosophy, and this is the part that we understand much, much more easily, even though we've unfortunately, it seems, sometimes forgotten what it is that we're supposed to be a part of. But it all starts back with Socrates there in Greece. He was the individual who created what has since become known as the Socratic method. And the Socratic method of learning is where Socrates would ask his students questions. Not because he didn't know the answer, but he wanted them to know the answer. He wanted them to know the answer for themselves. He wanted them to get the answers because they had to think about what he was asking and what he was looking for. And it required them to take the knowledge that they had been given and adopt it for their own and make it their own, so that when they spoke of their own volition, not just simply regurgitating what somebody else had taught them years ago. As a gospel preacher, it's been my privilege to work in 2 different schools of preaching over the years, and I cannot tell you, but some of the most proud moments I've ever had as an educator is going to the congregations where a former student of mine is preaching and hear him teach something that I taught him. Not the way I taught him, but in his own words, with his own examples and his own understanding, and putting his own emphasis in it and his heart into it. And he's teaching something that's really his. Then I know I did my job. If he just gets up there and just spits out what I told him 20 years ago, well, that didn't do any good. He didn't learn it. He memorized it, but he didn't learn it. It's only once he makes it his own and he teaches others from his own heart, that's when you know the light bulb went off over his head and he got it. It's the same thing from the Western philosophical perspective. We are supposed to think for ourselves. I don't mean to shock nobody. We are supposed to think for ourselves. It is not just one bumper sticker statement at a time. It is not this town hall meeting versus that town hall meeting. And, I hate Facebook. And especially this time of year in this kind of a political cycle. I just can't stand it. I use it for pictures of my grandbabies and pictures of birds. I take bird pictures because, I'm that exciting. And when I'm aggravated about something, I'll kind of make a smart aleck comment. But other than that, you're going to have a hard time finding me talking about this candidate or that candidate on Facebook, because it's just wretched the way people are. And they hear something, and I don't care which news station it is that you watch, whether it's CNN, ABC, NBC, MSNBC, Fox, I don't care. But people will hear something on TV, and then they'll repeat that to everybody they see, not having done any research whatsoever to see if it's actually true, maybe not even understanding what in the world it is they're talking about, but because they heard it on TV, surely they couldn't lie to us on TV. Except they do on a semi-regular basis. We're supposed to think for ourselves. We're supposed to know what we know and make it a part of us. Not only so that we can explain it to somebody else, but if we know what we know and make it a part of us, it will functionally alter who and what we are in our day-by-day lives. We'll be grounded, self-assured, understanding the principles at hand. I'm a big believer. I know we can't have poll taxes. I'm not advocating for that. That was a way to keep certain individuals of different classes from being able to vote. But now, a civics test before you're allowed to vote, that wouldn't hurt my feelings even a little bit. You ought to at least know what in the world you're talking about before we let you, make decisions and stuff. Socratic method assured that you did. He was actually executed, Socrates was, because he opposed democracy in Athens. Now see, that's a word, talk about people talking about things they have no idea what in the world they're talking about. Every time I hear somebody on the news, or worse yet, some politician who ought to know better, talk about how we're going to save our democracy, it just makes my skin crawl. In all of the foundational documents that were the establishment of this country, there is one word that is conspicuously missing throughout. Democracy. It's nowhere to be found. And that's because democracy is the rule of the mob. It's violent. It causes people to act rashly. They count noses, and when they get to 50% plus one, that's right. Never mind the morality of it. Never mind the intellectual integrity of it. A majority of people believe it. That's right. That's the way that it is. That's democracy. And the founders were deathly afraid of democracy because there has never been a democracy on the face of the earth that has not met a violent end. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but people talk about democracy all the time. Socrates saw that democracy was a threat, a danger to society, and he withstood it, and they killed him for it. Because once the majority decides that's the thing to do, then that's the thing to do. Plato was a student of Socrates. He's the one who gave us the Platonic forms, the idea that there isn't anything real. We don't really have a chair, but if you can think about a chair, and your favorite chair at home or whatever, Plato would argue that's not really a chair. The concept of a chair is really only, the true chair is really only in a spiritual realm. And it embodies the entire full extent of chairness. And each furniture maker envisions the true chair form and then does his best to copy that in the real physical world. But it's always going to have imperfections. It's always going to be temporal. Eventually it will fall apart, and if you sit in it once too often, you'll fall through. It's not the true chair. He said the true chair is up there in the spiritual realm, and all we have here are nothing more than just copies. Some better than others, but they're all just copies. But the true concept of chairness is out of our reach. But he said that was true for every single person, every single thing, every single object. He said there was a plane that was higher than humanity, that we could just aspire to, and we could try to be like that, but that we were all fallible. We were all fragile in some way or another, and so it was our goal to continually strive toward perfection, realizing none of us are, but there is an idea of the perfect man that we could aspire to. Now remember, this is 450 years before the birth of the Christ. Pretty smart man. He actually came up with a concept called the allegory of the cave. Anybody ever heard of the allegory of the cave before? Okay. He said, imagine that you and all your family and all your friends have for all your lives been inside of a cave. And you're strapped down, chained down, seated in this cave, facing the wall of the cave. That's all you've ever seen. Can't look around, you're just straight forward, that cave wall. And behind you, imagine there's a great fire burning. And there are other individuals who bring you food and drink and other things, and they walk in a pathway between you and the fire, so that their shadows are put up against the wall. And of course you're in a cave, so all the sounds are echoey and weird, and you can't really get a very good lock on what's going on, and all you see are these shadows, and that's it, and that's your reality. And that's all you know. And your vision of the world is formed by that, because you can't see or know or hear anything other than this, the echo sounds, and those shadows. Now those shadows aren't real, but they are to everybody who sees them, because that's all they know. Now suppose that an individual were to have his chains broken. And that individual, maybe it's you, and you go up out of the cave. You see what's going on all around you. You realize that the shadows on the wall aren't real. You thought they were, but they aren't real, and now you know they're not real. And you know what is real behind you that's making the shadows appear before you. And you step up to the edge of the cave, and there's just this blinding light because you've been in a cave your entire existence. And it's painful. It actually physically hurts to be outside of the cave. But of course, eventually your eyes adjust. And you're able to see the grass and the trees and the animals and the sky and clouds and the sun. And breathe the fresh air. And hear so much more clearly because you're not hearing the echoes within the cavern itself. And you see what the real world is for the very first time. And what are you going to do? Well, all my family and friends, they're back there chained up in a cave. They have no idea what they're missing. I'm going to go tell them about this so they can be free too. But Plato said they'll hate you for that. They'll think you're lying to them. They'll call you a traitor. You've betrayed our culture. You've betrayed our reality. You come up with these fanciful things that you've brought to us, and we all know that's not true because the cave wall tells us what's true. And he said, rare is the individual who can free himself from the context of his own existence and be able to recognize there's a great big world outside there that I've never experienced, that I don't know, and all the people around me are too frequently tied to the reality that's right in front of their face and they can't see anything else. Man, if that does not describe the American voter today, I don't know what does. I'm a Republican, so I don't want to hear anything else. I'm a Democrat. I don't want to hear anything else. I'm a Libertarian. Oh, you're way too crazy for me. But we don't consider that it's not just a difference of view, and it's not just a difference of ideas. Now it's gotten to the point that if you disagree with me, you are, by definition, wrong. Because you disagreed with me. Now, how many of y'all are the standard of right and wrong? You personally, you are the standard of right and wrong. Anybody want to claim that for themselves?
Not me.
If that's not who you are, then if someone disagrees with you, that doesn't mean they're wrong. That means they may be wrong, but shock of all shocks, perhaps just this time you could be mistaken. But that's not how we view things in our culture today. And not only are you wrong if you disagree with me, for some people, you're also evil too. You're a wicked, wasted human being because you see things differently than I do. And we've just lost our ever-loving minds as a society because of this viewpoint. And what you have is two groups of people chained to a cave, watching two walls of the same cave, and they're all hung up, my shadows versus your shadows, and so very few people actually know what in the world's going on in the middle causing everything we see. And if somebody steps outside and said, hey, listen, I don't mean to bust your bubble, but there's more to it, what are you talking about? You used to be so smart when you agreed with me about everything. How can you be so dumb now? Plato was explaining not 21st century America, not 5th century BC Greece. He was explaining humanity and how it is that we all tend to get lost in our own little world, seeing just that far in front of our noses, and we don't even think about what might be going on with somebody else. You get behind somebody and they're driving slow and erratic and they're just not paying any attention. Now, I'm sure you all are just kind, loving individuals when that goes on. I get a little hot. But over the years, I've tried to come to ask myself, I wonder if that individual's got something going on in their life that they're struggling with. Maybe they just lost a loved one. Somebody blows by me. I used to get aggravated. Now I kind of tell Caroline, I said, hey, look at this one. But what if they're racing to the hospital? You know, we just get so wrapped up in what's going on in our own world that it's just way too easy to forget that there's a whole big world out there that we're responsible to and for. Plato reminded us of that. He also talked about mixed government. He talked about mixed government, but what he was talking about it from our perspective was checks and balances. Now, this was later brought out in the writings of the French philosopher Montesquieu, and the idea of having an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. But that's the concept of mixed government. We don't just want one king, one tyrant dictator. We want a variety of individuals from different perspectives, different backgrounds, different goals, to try to work together to formulate government so that there are these checks and balances and no one thought process can run away with the entirety of it. Aristotle also was a student of Plato. So Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle, by the way, actually taught Alexander the Great of the Grecian Empire. So I mean, this is time-tested stuff here. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BC, roughly. He's the one who came up with Aristotelian logic, which is the basis of all modern logic. This is 2,500 years ago nearly, and he's the one who said, hey, what if we thought this way? And then everybody did. Logical, rational, making comparatives between two objects or classes of objects to be able to learn more effectively what they were and what they weren't, and to be able to make deductions based upon that logical analysis. He's the individual who established the concept of a cycle of government. He said that all governments start with anarchy. Everybody just stealing and doing everything they want to do, and it's just the biggest man can do whatever he wants because nobody else can stop him. And that concept of anarchy and people and all of the death and destruction and terror that brings, it makes people come together so they can rise up against the thugs, quite frankly. So all government starts from anarchy and it goes to monarchy because there's a really bad strong man out there. So what do we need? We need our own strong man to fight against him. And we make him king so that we don't have to worry about it. And he takes care of us like children. Provides for us and provides for our defense. And he's the one that takes care of us. And that's how monarchies come about. And that's how kings get crowned and put on a throne. After that, however, people get a little frustrated with that because, I mean, you know, the king's taking all of our stuff too, by the way. He's not just providing for us, he's also taking our stuff. So they'll ask for a group of individuals, leaders, to rise up and take away power from the king. And maybe if a group of them will lead us and guide us, that would be better. And of course, that's an oligarchy, the rule of the few. We saw that in the 14th century when King John of England was compelled by the lords of the land to sign the Magna Carta so that power could be divested throughout the kingdom. But that aristocracy that was ruling in that way, they abused the people just as well. They just did it all at once and all over in various segments of society. And so eventually the people rise up and they say, no, how about if we just take the power? And of course that's what democracy is. Demos being Greek for people, and the krasi being the arche or the ruling class. So democracy is the people rule themselves. The problem is people don't know what in the world they're doing. People think only about themselves most of the time. They're selfish, short-sighted, ignorant, far too often ignorant. And after people realize that they control their own purse strings and they start taking from people who produce and giving it to people who don't do anything, the government just simply isn't very long for this world. And so it eventually devolves back into anarchy. It just falls apart. Because people think they have the power and they start tearing down statues and stuff. You may have heard something about this, I don't know. They start holding their elected leaders hostage. They start destroying property. They start threatening individuals on the streets. It just devolves into that same, if you're big enough to get away with it, I guess you can. Aristotle said that is how all governments work. Throughout the history of man, they go from anarchy into monarchy into oligarchy into democracy and back into anarchy. And based on the news reports that I've seen recently, it kind of makes me nervous for our country as to where we are on that scale. Aristotle wrote, all constitutions have three elements, which the good lawgiver has to regard what is expedient for each constitution. There is one element that deliberates about public affairs. Secondly, that concerned with the magistrates. And thirdly, that which has judicial power. Well, that is exactly what our founders saw and used as the framework for our Constitution. They saw those individuals that dealt with public affairs and they called that the legislative branch. They saw those individuals that were designated as being concerned with that of the magistrates, and they said this is the executive branch. The individuals who actually make sure that the laws which are passed in the legislative branch, the executive branch executes those laws and makes sure that they get carried out according to the laws that were written. And then there is that which is dealing with the judicial, and of course that's the judicial branch, and that is the power that says these laws are unconstitutional. These actions are unconstitutional. And those three branches of government are the checks and balances that we have from Plato, from Socrates, from Aristotle, from Montesquieu as well. And they took them and they put them into our Constitution because that framework was not something they just came up with sitting around the tavern and somebody say, hey, you know what I thought would be cool? How about if we did it this way? They looked at that time for 1900 years of Western philosophical thought. Some of the smartest people who had ever walked the face of the earth, and they had all added bits and pieces to this image of what the best governmental form might look like. And the founders, geniuses in their own right, they took those things and they compiled them into documents the likes of which the world had never seen. Liberty, freedom for the individual, security from enemies abroad and at home, the right to petition and government about redress of grievances, the power maintained from the will of the people, but we're not going to be a democracy, we're going to be a republic. It's the republic because it's the public all over again. And when we elect people of ourselves, I mean they're one of us, and we send them to do our bidding, we're still in control, but they wield the sword that we gave them. All this was put into play because of these foundational philosophers of Western philosophy from Socrates onward. This wasn't a fly-by-night deal. They talked about it as if it were the American experiment, as though this had never been done before. That part's true, but they acted as though it were something that were just cobbled together by a couple of revolutionaries that were sitting around thinking about stuff. That's not it at all. They took all these things and they put them together. They also relied heavily on Thomas Hobbes, who was an English philosopher, 1588 to 1679. He looked at the concept of anarchy and he called that the state of nature. And he wrote about what would life be like if there were no laws, there were no governments, there were no police, and it was just everybody was allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. He said that life in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It'd be a war of all men against all men, continually. Without government, there wouldn't be anything to stop people from acting on their most depraved parts of their minds and their desires. And the only thing that could stop a person is if you were personally big enough, powerful enough to stop them from taking whatever it is that they wanted. And he said that's why we have to have laws. It's because of the state of nature. He went on to write a book. It was called Leviathan. It's an interesting title. Comes obviously from Job chapter 41 verses 1 through 34, talking about the Leviathan. But what he said is that the Leviathan, the Bible says the reason that he was so powerful was because of his scales. Whatever this creature was. Sounds like a dinosaur to me, but I wasn't there, so I don't know. But his scales were so tough and so tightly woven together that no arrow, no spear, no sword could pierce his hide. And that's in part why the Leviathan was as indestructible as he was. And what Hobbes said in his book, Leviathan, he said society can be like that if the people will just come together. No one monarch, I don't care how many armies he has, I don't care how much power or wealth he has, no one monarch is capable of standing against the people if they would just come together. But apparently this division in my side, your side, and their side, that's been going on for a while, and they just wouldn't do it. People said, well, I can't have you get something out of this unless I'm getting something too. I mean, where's mine? Not recognizing that the goal was for everybody to receive power and authority and a way of life that they controlled instead of some goofy king sitting up in the castle. Hobbes said if the Leviathan would ever just rise from the muck, nothing could stand in its way. That's kind of what they did in 1776. John Locke, the father of liberalism, 1632 to 1704. Liberalism, I need to explain, is not how we use the term today in American politics. He wasn't a liberal the way that we think of liberals in politics. Classical liberalism is actually what modern American conservatism is. It's a seeking to devolve the power from a strong centralized governmental force and give it back to the people. It's desiring to make sure that everybody has their own rights, their own liberties, and they're responsible for protecting them and providing for themselves and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. John Locke was an individual who was extraordinarily prolific in his writings. He said that there were undeniable truths of right that were given to us by our Creator, and that among these are life and liberty. And y'all know the rest, right? Life, liberty, and... Yeah, he didn't say that. He said life, liberty, and property. And when Thomas Jefferson totally plagiarized John Locke, he changed it to the pursuit of happiness, because after all, here in America, being happy means having more stuff, right? Life, liberty, and property, Locke wrote about. He said, if I'm not secure in my life, I'm not free. If I'm not secure with my liberties, I'm not free. If I can't control my own home, I'm not free. Don't tell me I'm free unless I have the ability and the capacity to control my own destiny, politically speaking. Like I said, Thomas Jefferson and several others, they took what it wasn't considered plagiarism back then. I think we made up those rules so that we would quit ripping off Thomas Jefferson after he ripped off John Locke. But they took these principles and they are deeply ingrained in our foundational documents. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we all know that. Came straight from John Locke, the father of liberalism. Voltaire, he's an individual French philosopher, 1694 to 1788. He's the individual who was the proponent of freedom of religion. That people ought to be free to worship as they see fit. Now, that's a struggle for us because we know there's no freedom of religion outside of what God has told us we are to do. I'm not free to worship our God as I see fit. I am free and compelled to worship Him as He sees fit. And I cannot say that those who are round about, who are worshiping in a way that is contrary to the Word of God, incorrect according to the standard that God gave, I can't say that that worship is all right. But what I can say, and what I will uphold is that every single individual has the right within themselves to choose whether they will submit themselves to the will of God or whether they will not. We cannot compel people to become faithful Christians. And even if we could, it wouldn't work. Because unless they willingly give themselves over to the Lord, wherein is the glory for Him? Voltaire said everybody has to have the right to choose how or even if they're going to worship God or something else. He also talked about the right to a fair trial, which was completely foreign to the political and governmental world of the ancient world. Free and fair trial. What in the world are you talking about? Do you want to be fed to the lions, or do you want to be fed to the hyenas in the Colosseum? That was your basic choice. There aren't any trials. We think you did it. We're the ones with the guns. There you go. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, another French philosopher. He wrote about the social contract theory. He wrote that man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Maybe they're chains of our own making. Maybe we're chained up inside of a cave looking at shadows. But we're not really free unless and until we choose to exercise those liberties. That's when we become freed from our chains. He says that happens under the social contract theory. I know normally when somebody's preaching, they're not asking you to speak up. But this time, I kind of need you to, okay? We all know this. Sometimes rules are different for different parts of the country, different regions, whatever. But we all know this. I feel fairly confident. So you're driving down the highway or down the street, and there's a traffic signal up there, and you see the green light, and that means go. And you see a red light, and that means, and a yellow light means hit it. Yeah, that's right. Everybody knows that. That means get it. Why do we stop at a red light?
That's a law.
It's a law.
Safety.
Safety. Anybody else? It's what we've always done. Yeah. The reality of it is when we see the red light and we take our foot off the gas and put it on the brake, we're not thinking about the law. No.
I want that traffic camera.
You may be concerned about the consequences of the law, but we're not seriously thinking, okay, in subtitle 2.43.78, it says thusly, thou shalt stop at all. No, we're not doing that. And we're not thinking about safety either, not really. I mean, nobody takes their foot off the gas and puts it on the brake and says, here I am saving the rest of humanity from the trajectory of the missile on wheels that I was driving heretofore. And now I'm going to bring it to a soft and subtle stop because otherwise someone might be harmed. Nobody thinks that either. Some people may be thinking about the traffic light and the camera, and some people may be thinking about the cop around the corner. But the vast majority of us are stopping on red because that's just the way it is. We're like that Pavlovian dog that every time the bell rings, we start salivating because we're fixing to get fed. We've just been trained. That's how society is. And we don't question it. And because we don't question it, the lights tend to work. And when someone runs a red light, we are all personally, even if nothing happened, nobody's car got hit, nobody got run over, but we see somebody run a red light, and it's just a clutch my pearls moment, and we're all just personally offended. How in the world did they get away with such a travesty? Whereas if the light were green, they could have done exactly the same thing, and we're just fine with it. We're conditioned. And that societal contract that we all enter into. I am able to have safety and security because of y'all. Now, in order to achieve that safety and security, I have to give up some things. I can't act a fool in just any old way that I want to. I can't just punch people in the nose walking down the street. I can't just take stuff that looks good to me. I have to curb those things that would harm the rights of others so that I can be a part of society, and the social contract binds us together. And depending on where you live, the social contract will have subtle differences about how you're supposed to behave. Now, where I'm from, probably pretty close to where y'all are from, on account of how my ancestors came from here. I bet it's not too different. But I live and work up in northern Missouri. And as David and Lane will tell you, that is a completely different world. It's amazing how much difference 200 miles will make. But heading 200 miles north, I had somebody call me a liar one time. And I said, yeah, that's exactly right. I had to set him down and I said, look, I'm sure you think you're right. And I'm sure you think I'm wrong. But see, you don't understand what it means to be a full-blown multi-generational hillbilly. But if you call me a liar, now we are liable to end up rolling around on the ground over that. You can disagree. You can say I'm wrong. You can say I'm silly-minded. You can say I'm completely devoid of fact and no intelligence whatsoever, and we'll just agree to disagree. You call me a liar one more time, we're going to have us a problem. Because where I'm from, the social contract says you don't call another man a liar unless you're just ready to have the full-blown show. You just don't do that. My dad whipped us. If we called each other liars when we was kids, you get yourself whipped, don't you call your brother a liar. Well, he lied. I don't care. Don't you call him a liar. We don't tolerate it. Social contract. Don't violate the social contract. Adam Smith, the last one I want to talk about this evening. 1726 to 1790, the father of economics. He's the individual who believed that there was what he termed an invisible hand that guided the trade of goods and services between individuals. Not a literal invisible hand, but that there were certain principles that people won't make a trade unless they think it benefits them for some reason. People won't make a trade unless they think they're getting something out of it. So I'll trade my money for your stuff if your stuff is important to me. But if your stuff is junk in my eyes, I'm keeping my money. There is no trade. There must be an exchange of values. And unless those values are similar in qualitative worth, no deal. I'm not giving you more money for your junk just because your junk you think is priceless heirlooms. If you think it's worth that much, you ought to keep it. Because ain't nobody going to buy that mess. If you have something that I find more valuable than the cash that you're asking for, we got us a deal. And Smith said that this concept of trade and interaction between people was important because that's what allowed the economies and the society to grow. And people needed to be free. You shouldn't have price fixing. You shouldn't have people who are able to sell this but nobody else has, no monopolies. You shouldn't have foreign trade coming in and taking away opportunities from the people who are here at home. Therefore, he's called the father of capitalism as well. And all of this was put into place in the foundational documents by our founding fathers because they saw all of this work, all of this philosophical bases, and put them together in one place. That had never happened before. The ideas had been around sometimes for thousands of years, but nobody had ever said, hey, what if we take all the cool stuff and put it in one basket? The founding fathers did that. They took all of the really good principles and foundational visions and put them in one place First, they did it in the Declaration of Independence. And if you haven't ever actually read the Declaration of Independence, I want to encourage you to do so. Don't just get down to the part where it talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and say, okay, I've done enough. Read the whole thing. Read about the long train of abuses that King George III had done against our forefathers. And this is why we're separating ourselves from him. This is why, because they said, Adam Smith said we ought to have free and fair trade, and y'all won't let us have it. They said that Jean-Jacques Rousseau says we should have the ability to be safe in our society, our societal contract. And our societal contract is different than yours is over in England. And some of the rules that y'all go by, that's not our rules. You shouldn't impose your views on us. John Locke, the father of liberalism, life, liberty, and property. He also said that knowledge only comes from experience. He says that we are all born as a tabula rasa, which is Latin for a blank slate. We know what we know because of what we've been taught since we were a child. And you can't come over from England and tell us that us and our entire life experience is wrong. And we have to bow down and submit to a king that none of us have ever seen and we're never going to. Thomas Hobbes, they said it's a state of nature. You can't just throw off the king and just let everybody run amok. There's got to be a government. There's got to be something that's put together so people can live and breathe free. And Aristotle said it has to be a government that has those three components. It's got to have a legislative branch. It's got to have an executive branch. It's got to have a judicial branch. Plato says that it's got to be something we've got to step out of the cave, politically speaking. You can't do things that we've always done just because we're doing them. Think for yourselves. Get out there and find something that matters, something that's real, something that's truly, uniquely American. And Socrates, you got to start asking yourself the question, what if? What if we thought for ourselves? What if we took all of this and combined it in such a way that not only we, but our children and our grandchildren and our great-great-great-great-grandchildren could live free in a world subjugated by monarchs and despots and tyrants and kings and armies of all stripes? What if there was one place on the face of the earth where people could actually be free? And so that's what they did. They took all of that. And they made this nation the way that it is. And it just turns my stomach when I hear people say that all of that isn't good enough. Because I'm not getting enough free stuff. Or I'm not getting things my way. Or I don't like the color of your skin. Or I don't like how much money you have. Or I don't think it's fair that you've got the job, or the talent, or the knowledge, or the intelligence, or the capacities that I don't have. And so we're going to throw it all out so that we can slip into anarchy. It ought not be. But it'll only be stopped when we remember the anchor that we're supposed to be tied to. The Declaration of Independence. The Constitution of the United States of America. That Western philosophical framework that's given us everything that we have politically. Every other lesson is going to be a little bit more biblical than that one, but you got to have that one for the rest of them to make any sense. I appreciate your time and attention.